So, in discussing population growth and the fact that it's going to continue, are there any solutions that we can apply in order to slow human population growth so that we don't reach the carrying capacity of the Earth? This slide just lists a few quick ideas of how to slow population growth. One of the first objectives is reduce poverty, elevate the status of women, and make family planning available. Another approach that can be used is to promote economic development within some of the countries that are least developed countries. This can also help stabilize the population. If you watch the video before doing this short video lecture series, the video that was on population growth, it discussed demographic transition. Basically, the demographic transition is that as countries begin to industrialize and develop economically, the per capita income rises. As a result, poverty declines and populations start to grow more slowly. It happens in 4 stages: the pre-industrial, the transitional, the industrial, and the post-industrial stage. This graphic depicts the demographic transition. To phrase it more simply, a demographic transition occurs when high birth and high death rates shift to low birth and low death rates. On the y-axis, we have birth rate and death rate, number per 1,000 per year. On the x-axis, it's growth rate over time. Growth rate being depicted as low growth rate, increasing, very high, decreasing, low growth rate, 0, negative. So it's pertaining to the population growth rate on the x-axis. The 4 stages of the demographic transition are also depicted. As mentioned earlier, some nations are completing this transition, but half of the world is stuck in the 5th decade of rapid population growth. You also have the situation where low-income nations want economic development. They want to become middle or even high-income nations such as Thailand, South Korea, and Brazil. In stage 1, the pre-industrial stage, the population grows very slowly because of a high birth rate, which is basically in order to offset the high infant mortality rate, as well as a high death rate. So we're not seeing much population growth during stage 1. During stage 2, population grows rapidly because birth rates are high, but yet death rates have decreased because maybe there's improved food production, maybe there's better sanitation, or more health care available to the population. So you can see in the graphic, the birth rate is still, somewhat high, but yet the death rate declined, and as a result, total population still grew. Stage 3, the industrial stage, the population growth is going to start to slow down as both the birth rate and the death rate drops, mainly because there's improved food availability to people, there's better health care, there's education, and there's been economic growth. So as you can see with the red line on the graph, the birth rate has decreased. The blue line on the graph, the death rate has stabilized, and total population growth doesn't have as steep as a curve, but it is still going to continue to grow, just not as a fast rate as what it was previously. And then stage 4 is when the population growth levels off and may even start to decline as birth rates equal and then fall below death rates. As mentioned earlier, there are some countries that are actually in a declining situation pertaining to their population, Japan being the one that is in this category the most. So let's look at a country that implemented population control measures: China. China's population is the largest population in the world with 1.379 billion people. Currently, China's population grows by 1 child every 4 seconds. In 1982, about 35 years ago, the population grew by nearly 400 million people. China also represents about 19.2 2% of the world's population. And it's projected that by 2050, the population will be at about 1.3 billion. They're expecting it to decrease slightly. So how did this come about? In the 1940s and the 1950s, government policies encouraged large families. The population increased a lot in this time frame. They also experienced in the 1960s threat of famine, and the Chinese government was concerned about this. In fact, they did have 20 to 40 million people die because of famine and disaster. The Chinese government was the first to create an extensive, intrusive, and strict family planning and birth control program. This was primarily done in order to protect their country from suffering famine. In 1979, the government one-child policy was implemented. The graph on the right side of your screen depicts how many children Chinese people are allowed to have. About 36% of the Chinese population only has one child. About 53% of Chinese population are allowed to have two children if the first child is a girl. There's a small percentage of the Chinese population, about 9.6, that are permitted to have two children regardless of the sex of the first child. And there's an even smaller percentage of population in China where 1.6% of the people have more than two children. So there is opportunity for families to have more than one child, especially if the first child is a girl. That's about 52% of the population. And there's a small percentage, almost 10%, where they're allowed to have two children regardless of the sex of the child. But about 36% of the population only has one child. So when this policy was implemented, they used some incentives to help foster the idea of one child. If you had one child, you would get a bonus each year. You would get better housing. You would be provided more food. You would get free medical care, salary bonuses, and you would end up with preferred job opportunities for your child if the child was from a one-child family. The disincentives were if you had more than one child and you didn't fall into any of the criteria that allowed you to have more than one child, you would have to pay more taxes and repay any bonuses you may have received. This policy effectively reduced the total fertility rate of China from 5.7 children being born on average per female during their reproductive time frame to 1.5 children being born to women during the reproductive time frame. So this was a drastic cut in their total fertility rate. This controversial one-child law has caused the population growth in China to slow dramatically. Just recently, China relaxed this policy to allow more parents to have a second child. So some quick facts on this policy. It was created in 1975 by the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. It's still in place today, but with a little bit of a relaxed policy. This policy applies mostly to the Han Chinese that live in urban areas of the country, not rural, but urban, so cities. The Han Chinese represent more than 92% of China's total population, and they are allowed to have another child if their family first had a female baby. So some additional facts on China's one-child policy. The graph on the right depicts a color-coded rendition of sex ratio, boys for 100 girls. And the dark red colors indicate that there's more than 150 boys for 100 girls. Why is this important? Well, on average in the global ratio is about 107 males to every 100 females. So if you're having a scenario in a specific geographic region where you have more than 150 boys for 100 girls, you're exceeding what the global ratio is. In other words, there's an imbalance for the male to female population ratio. In China, they actually have 30 more million men than women. On average, throughout China, there are 113 males to every 100 females. So the graphic on the right just depicts the child sex ratio, boys for 100 girls. All right, the chart on the left is related to abortion statistics from a set list of countries that are depicted there. China has 10 times more abortions annually than the US. The data indicates that there are 13 billion abortions per year in China. This equates to 1,484 abortions per hour, compared to the US abortion rate of 138 abortions per hour. Part of the reason the abortion rate increased significantly in China is because families wanted to have boys as children in order to carry on the family name. So if they had a daughter first or knew they were going to have a daughter, they would selectively choose to not have that child and then try again to have a boy, especially if they were in the scenario where they were only permitted to have one child regardless of sex. So the pros and cons pertaining to this policy. The pros are that the policy was successful in keeping the population size from increasing beyond control. The policy also helped reduce the amount of people who rely on natural resources, and it could be viewed as a step in the direction towards environmental sustainability. The cons are that an imbalanced sex ratio resulted with more men than female. They're falling into problems with taking care of elderly people now. With the decreased population growth rate, they have a smaller young population and a larger older population, as well as there's concern for human rights violations in regards to whether or not people were forced to have abortions. So, the policy actually met its goal. It was put into place for the sole purpose of controlling the growing population. Going back to the pro, where it reduces the amount of people who rely on natural resources, we understand that more people equals a greater demand on natural resources. This in turn means that increasing population will be putting a greater strain on the environment. So the one-child policy puts the population in check so that it doesn't strain the natural resources too much. To give you an example, China has 16 of the 20 most polluted areas in the world. It's due to the fact that the large labor force releases massive amounts of harmful substances into the environment. Also, with a larger population comes larger waste, which increases pollution into the environment as well. So we're back to this slide which you saw at the beginning. Please remember that you have an extra credit opportunity, and at this time please go to the website indicated on your slide on a new browser and document the time of day, the US population, and the global population, and then calculate the number of more people in the US, the number of more people in the world, and the amount of time that lapsed from the first time that you documented these values. Then go to the D2L discussion board that's titled Human Population and enter the information that you collected, as well as respond to the directions for a very brief comment essay in the discussion forum. This concludes our video lecture series pertaining to human population growth.